Welcome everyone. My name is Danielle. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Hopkinton Public Library. I'm very pleased to have you all here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And without further ado, I will introduce to you Jennifer, who is going to be speaking on her book, The Actually Autistic Guide to Advocacy. Please welcome her.
Doing a quick regular glasses moment to just say hello. Hi, thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you, and thank you, Ashley. So thank you all so much for coming. And that's some of my family is here, so if they're a little irreverent, you'll know why. But I'm Jennifer Brunton. I was assigned female at birth, autistic human. I use she, they pronouns, and as you just heard, I'm the author of The Actually Autistic Guide to Advocacy. And I'm also the author of a forthcoming book that's a similar guide, but it's for autistic youth. I'm ridiculously, insanely excited about it. I think we're about a year away from publication, but this one is going to be called, the working title is The Actually Autistic Guide to Building Independence, Step-by-Step Practical Advice for Teens, Young Adults, and Those Who Care About Them. I also write a blog called Full Spectrum Mama, and I work as an editor and writer, mostly about science, business, tech, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, ESG, this is corporate speak for like the good stuff. I try to steer my editing toward that, my corporate work toward that kind of stuff. And I work with sustainability quite a bit as well, corporate sustainability. In my spare time, I'm partner to a neurotypical person. I'll use the abbreviation NT for that throughout the talk at times. I parent my 17-year-old neurotypical daughter. My daughter was adopted from China. I only mention this because I can't imagine having genetically produced a neurotypical child, but she's awesome. She's not here tonight. And I live with my autistic son and his neurodivergent or ND partner as they raise their baby in our family home. And so my advocacy is grounded in a lot of personal experience, both as an autistic person who's experienced a lot of different environments and also as a mom. My life, particularly as a mother, has made me a really fierce advocate, and I've learned a lot along the way. So I'm going to speak from my own perspective, but I'm also going to share the experiences and ideas of the more than 100 autistic people who contributed to our first book, and the more than 100 autistic teens, young adults, and adults who contributed to our second book. So I've got a lot of insights from neurodivergent people to share. I'm obviously, for the obvious reasons, especially passionate about making the world a better place to grow up as an autistic person. And I really want autistic youth to know that their voices matter. So I'm super passionate about empowering autistic people, especially young people, to dream big and to expect better of the world. So I'll be speaking sort of from both of those books, as well as the book that hasn't come out yet, and then also from my own experience. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking about how both neurotypical and neurodivergent people, whether it's ourselves or as parents, as partners, siblings, other family members, teachers and other educators, friends, therapists, or anyone else interested in furthering inclusion and positive evolution, can advocate and ally with autistic people in ways that genuinely center autistic experiences and uplift and honor our perspectives. I'm going to be discussing both mindsets or ways of thinking and actions, things we can do, that explicitly and effectively reject sort of a predominant mindset that we encounter a lot, which is like a deficit mindset and or a discriminatory mentality. And these mindsets and actions can proactively make life better for autistic people so that we can all take meaningful steps to grow together. And I really feel very strongly, something that I'll come back to again and again, as we move through this incredible political moment that we're in, that when we uplift one group who may be oppressed, we uplift everyone. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about myself, my own history with neurodivergence, and also talk about the fundamental premises of my work and books. I'll take a little pause at that point for clarification questions, and then I'll get a little deeper into the principles of actually autistic advocacy and allyship for about 35, 40 minutes, with another pause if it feels like our brains are getting full. And then I'll leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions if we have them. It's not a huge group tonight, so maybe more like 10. Just a few quick housekeeping details first. I have a mailing list sign up here. If people want to, I send out mailings maybe once or twice a year, but what I also do when I give talks is I send out some resources. I actually have a visual that I've tried again and again during my talks to manage a visual while I give the talk, and I'm just not capable. I'm literally not capable. So I have sort of a thing that just really summarizes the talk that I send out after my talks, and I also have a resource page which has a book discount link, my contacts, a survey link. We're still accepting survey responses from autistic youth for our next book. We've sort of almost done with the book, but we're still adding in insights from respondents. What else does it have on it? Oh, it has a link to something I'm super excited about, which is we made a discussion guide coming out of one of my library talks, actually in Northampton. The audience suggested doing a discussion guide because they wanted to do a reading group, a discussion group, and so we have a really great, it's like 12 pages, 10 sessions based on the chapters in the first book. Really thorough way to meet, and there's a couple of groups meeting right now. I don't know if some of them have an online component, but meeting to just go through the book and use the discussion guide to go deeper into their advocacy and allyship. So I can send all that. If you don't want to get my once a year mailings or whatever, you can just say just the resources or something like that on the list. Okay. Oh, and last thing, I have sort of slow auditory processing, so sometimes with questions it might take me a minute to come up with an answer. So before I dive into all of that, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that there is really a lot going on right now, especially today in the news. There's a super lot going on. And I think that just being here in community together is somewhat brave. It's come to feel brave after the last few years. So I really appreciate your presence. And I think we're all a little maybe traumatized or scared, but we're here together. And I think we're all still reckoning with the impact of this ongoing pandemic and all the geopolitical, environmental chaos, particularly on sensitive and vulnerable populations, including neurodivergent people. But I also, blah, 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 I knew she was going to say that. But I also really think we're encountering a unique opportunity to shape things a little differently. You know, we learned a lot more about how people learn, for example, during the pandemic, and we've sort of been a little more nimble with the ways that we teach people or the ways that we gather. You know, I had some talks that we switched to Zoom in a snowstorm. Like we're a little more flexible in the ways that we can interact, and I think that that can hopefully just be another way that we create more connections between different groups of people and help to uplift vulnerable populations. And I'm really glad we're getting these actually autistic voices out there during that shift so that they can help shape that. So I'm going to start with a super brief history of my own neurodivergent journey. Since biologically born females have a pretty complicated history with not only diagnosis but recognition as autistic. I had a really super happy childhood. I mostly remember kind of being in my own world, but really happy about them. If anyone has any questions about dinosaurs, tropical fish, cats, I had every book in the Connecticut library system on cats come to my local library, or even early 1980s mail order makeup kits. I've got you, because I know all about those things still. As I got a little older, I became, I'm going to say, quite unhappy. I started to realize that I was different from other people, and I noticed that around the same time that puberty hit and everything else, and my family imploded to some extent. I did try to pass as a normal person, but I was never successful. I was always that person who, like, I was the one with the fluffy mohawk. Like, it didn't have the spikes. I was like trying to mohawk, but it didn't work. So I realized that I was autistic when I was in graduate school in my 20s. I read a book called Nobody Nowhere. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. It's a pretty sad book, very intense, but it was the first time I ever recognized my own brain. I was diagnosed in my late 30s. It was basically a non-event. I had a lot of other things going on, a rough divorce. I was a working single mom. My son's autism diagnosis, my own diagnosis with some autoimmune stuff, and PTSD. So over the last decade, largely through parenting my amazing, brilliant, kind, funny, perfect in every way autistic son, getting him through at times, and by the way, he's here, I have permission from him to mention him the couple of times that I do, getting him through the special education system as whole and unharmed as possible, occasionally seeing him bullied, or more sneakily but very harmfully seeing him underestimated. I became an advocate and activist coming out of that. I probably wouldn't have done it for myself. I was just sort of trying to pass and hide, but for one's child, one will often do those things. And that made me want to write these books. Like many of my neurodivergent friends, I've attended more than the average amount of schools. And I've explored many careers, from yoga center owner to real estate business person to a professor to nonprofit work, before landing on a writer-editor position, which really suits my neurology. It was hard to find a good fit over the years, whether for schools or careers. There were a lot of things that that weren't quite working for me. So I'm really excited to be in a position now where I can, where I've found a career that really works for me, and where I can tell other people who struggle that in time that they can find that too. I've always been able to do the work, but it was more the social dynamics and the unspoken social codes that really kind of tripped me up at times. So overall, these decades of very diverse schooling, very diverse social environments, very diverse workplace experiences, I really came to understand that it wasn't really like the details of an environment or a relationship that would create equity or equality for neurodivergent people and others, but instead the tone of that environment. Does a person, a group, or an environment, or an institution welcome all people or not? I found that welcoming places and cultures are not necessarily so much autism friendly as they are human friendly. And so you'll have people who act and look and might identify differently, yet feel very comfortable together. And in workplaces and institutions that are full of open-minded or genuinely diverse, and by that I mean diverse in a variety of ways, people, chances are that they really don't even give a rip if you're neurodivergent, right? So in the new book, we've been asking this question, like, where was an environment that you felt comfortable? And a lot of people say libraries. Right? Libraries have quiet spaces, and they have more social spaces, and they have, you know, a whole bunch of different people finding refuge, I think, quite often. I found that the college I went to was wonderfully inclusive, and I think it really spoiled me because when I would go to other environments, like the graduate school that I went to that was much more rigid and had that sort of hierarchical or just different kinds of dynamics that I didn't really understand. I found that very challenging. So when you're in these truly inclusive places, such as a library, you can also express your needs more comfortably. So they might not, that environment might not meet your particular sensory need or need for silence or something like that, but you can express that because you feel comfortable doing that. And you can be seen and heard for who you are. So in those environments, people accept differing needs, a need for adaptations, differing goals, different ways of presenting ourselves as human as really basic to the wonderful diversity of human being. And many of us, not just autistic people, but plenty of people who don't fit this typical mold will struggle in homes or schools or workplaces or other environments that feel judgmental or regimented or normative or hierarchical. We struggle in environments that operate according to rules we don't understand. This can be a cultural thing as well. You know, if you're not native to a particular environment, there may be rules that you're just not understanding or seeing. But that's sort of often how it can be for autistic people in the neurotypical world. But in those open and accepting spaces and cultures, we can really flourish. So we can grow, and then we can add to the culture for everyone's benefit, right? It's not just that it benefits one person, it benefits the whole culture, and then we ourselves are more likely to succeed in those kind of environments. I want to read a quote from Jamie Knight, who is a writer and developer from London, from our book. He says, "Many neurotypical advocates think that autism causes behaviors. In my experience, that's backwards. Badly designed environments cause barriers, and barriers cause behaviors. Badly designed environments can disable everyone. Because most environments don't consider my needs, I encounter more design errors than other people do. Remove the environmental barriers and I thrive." So, Jamie Knight says, "I think good autism advocacy focuses on removing barriers in the environment." And this is really important. He says, barriers may be built things, but they can also be attitudes, expectations, or assumptions. So I'm going to be sharing some actually more detailed kind of practical ideas about how to advocate for and foster such environments. But I think bottom line, they start with the intention to create comfort and safety and inclusivity for all, just by our very being in that space. So I invite you all to create that feeling here and now in this room so that we can all feel comfortable and welcome in our own ways of being. And so now that we've made this safe space, we can also acknowledge that these inclusive contexts are not at all what we encounter a lot of the time. And I'm sure each of you may have your own examples. But I'll give some examples from my own recent direct experience. So for one example, last year I got my doctorate at Columbia, and Columbia Magazine was really excited about getting a writer to do a piece about this book and me when it came out. And they wrote this wonderful article. It was a uplifting, positive article about this book and me. And Columbia Magazine goes out to like 300,000 or 400,000 like super influential people, and I was really excited about it. And then they only had room for one piece on autism, so they decided to bump that article to the next issue because they wanted to publish an article about some Columbia scientists who were doing autism prevention research. And they literally published an article on autism prevention instead of the article on this book. So, you know, and it was the same editors, right? It was these really nice, really smart editors who were trying to celebrate autism and then planning to eradicate it at the same time. So those are the attitudes and assumptions that Knight, the quote that I read earlier, is talking about. Luckily, they actually let me address that whole issue in the article when it did come out. They re-interviewed me, and I was able to say quite firmly what I thought about that article. But really, another example is at a different talk I recently did. An autistic person who attended the talk said that they don't want to be autistic, and we had a long talk about it during the Q&A, and it emerged that they feel that way not because there's something inherently wrong with them, but because of how the neurotypical world often treats people with differing ways of thinking or differing ways of being. And so that's why I'm here, basically. I want to do everything I can so that fewer and fewer people feel that way until no one does. And like most or all of you, I hate public speaking, so you know I really care about this issue. So you're here because you want to, in small or large ways, to advocate, right? I don't know if it's for yourselves or for a child or friend or partner. I heard as I was driving, I've been around about, I met my co-author yesterday in Salem. It was really nice. She was there with her family. They live in the Midwest, but I was listening to the radio a lot and hearing a lot about different kinds of what I see as human rights being challenged in the current political climate. And I was listening to someone speaking about trans rights on the radio yesterday and saying how silence is complicity, that if anyone is oppressed, any one of us is vulnerable to oppression, so that speaking up is incredibly important for any group that's oppressed. And I really think in this civil rights frontier of neurodiversity, we also need some major shifts in perspective. And like I said earlier, sometimes I think that it's getting better, but it's not. So there are real ups and downs with it. But if we want the future to be better for neurodivergent people, we really have to continue to work toward that. And one of the things that we're trying to do in our books is find ways to do that that are genuinely inclusive, right? So sometimes people want to advocate and they pick something that they think will be really helpful, and it can end up backfiring for autistic people themselves. So what kinds of change do we want, right? What kinds of spaces and cultures will genuinely nurture and uplift us? If you take a moment to bring your neurodivergent loved ones or yourself to mind, what do you and we truly want a better world to look like? What do we genuinely need to consider, and what do we need to do if we're going to bring about a better world for neurodivergent people? We have proactively created this small safe space this evening in this deconsecrated church space at the library, where people who don't fit the norm can bring their whole selves, right? Anybody who comes into this space, we've created this space for that. Right? How do we develop and live that inclusivity in other environments, in schools, in our homes, out in public? How do we then persevere until there are fewer and fewer non-welcoming spaces and more welcoming spaces? Our idea in this book is that we start with ourselves and then we go from there, right? So I'm going to share tonight some principles behind advocating to foster those kinds of spaces and cultures. And then also some down-to-earth suggestions for real actions you can take to do so. So whether you're looking to evolve your home or family environment, an organizational team, so that could be a business, it could be a school, sensory environments, a classroom, your self-confidence, a therapy practice, is all of these principles that I'm going to talk about tonight will impact those for the better. Why did we choose the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic approach? Some people get a little alienated or turned off by that because they think it's marginalizing to people who are not autistic, but we're just trying to get those voices heard, right? They've been historically not heard. We also believe that the change we work for should fundamentally be shaped by those who will be most affected. And in this context, that's autistic people themselves. Now, of course, just like neurotypical people, neurodivergent people are not monolithic. We're not all the same. We're all completely different. My son and I, for example, are polar opposites in many ways, right? He's a seeker, I'm an avoider. I get migraines from basically like just existing, never mind like smelling something or seeing a bright color, and he can swim in ice cold water. We used to call him the Arctic seal. So we need really different things as we move through the world. But what we share is the need to be heard and seen as people with equal worth, as well as our own unique ways of being. So in this book, we wanted to not merely build awareness, but make a strong and logical and irrefutable case for actual acceptance. So what acceptance includes for us is respect for neurodiversity, knowledge about neurodiversity, inclusion, so not tolerance. Tolerance often sets the tolerant group above those tolerated and kind of wants to like reward the tolerant people for how patient they are. Well, genuine inclusion means really welcoming and really allowing people to belong, right? Enabling people to belong. And acceptance for us also includes justice, meaning that in institutions and in societies and in cultures, neurodivergent people have equity. Sorry. That we have a level playing field, right? And equal rights. But I want to also be clear that while acceptance might consist of all those things that I just outlined, it actually fundamentally means that you don't need to know these details about my way of being human. You don't need to know my neurology, my sexuality, my genetic race or ethnicity. You don't need to know my nationality, my physical or other abilities, disabilities, or differences, my gender identity. You don't need to know about any of those details to, on a very basic level, accept me and offer the very same respect due to any human being. So we really try to start with a very fundamental and unconditional acceptance. So to promote these values of equity and equality and real acceptance, we wanted to center autistic people finding out what they themselves say about both how neurodivergent people can better advocate for themselves and those they care about, but also how neurotypical people can be genuinely supportive allies and advocates. We also firmly believe that actually autistic perspectives are the most important input when you're figuring out how autism should be defined and framed. I had actually a big falling out with someone I had been in a writing group with for 10 years who was a licensed clinical social worker, psychiatric social worker, and who was very angry with me for saying that autistic people should have some voice in how autism is defined and framed. And that was tough, right? But we strongly believe that we should. We're the people who experience it. We also believe that autistic perspectives should inform how best to speak up around or align with each autistic person's unique needs and preferences. And finally, that actually autistic perspectives should inform how we advocate and ally with the wider autistic community. So we looked at, when in this first book, with more than 100 autistic people's insights, we looked at the key elements of effective and respectful and inclusive advocacy and allyship based on their life experiences. And then we did that for how to build independence on this next round, talking to autistic young people. Just to get back to the actually autistic hashtag, there's a lot of pain in the autism community around historic marginalization, infantilization, discrimination. And I think that does come out sometimes as defensiveness. So there can be a lot of kind of bickering that occurs from time to time. But so there might be angry or exclusionary uses of this hashtag out there. But one, that's not really where we're coming from. We do have a strong perspective. But also, I think that this pain that you see sometimes really comes from the challenges of being autistic in a neurotypical world. It's not something that's inherent to autism. It comes from encountering a lot of situations that can be very challenging. But in any case, our main point is that there's a lot we can do as autistic people and people who care about us to mitigate this pain and difficulty, and that's largely what I'm going to talk about. Any questions so far? Just a quick pause. Any need for clarification? Questions? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so when we were working through all of these perspectives that we got in, we wanted to amplify this wisdom and these experiences, and we had to organize it. So we came up with 9 steps, and they're organized in 3 progressive stages. We start with the personal, and we move on from there with basically like transformative ideas and attitudes and actions you can take, which are all based on this some certain 5 basic concepts. And then we take these principles or concepts and we look at them on the small scale of individual lives and learning, and then we move on to like homes and schools and workplaces. And then we take it to the third level, so it's personal, individual lives, and then the homes and workplaces, and then the third level is like cultures and societies. And this approach basically allows us to shape advocacy on all levels, depending on what you as the reader are looking to evolve, and also based on what autistic people really want. We really wanted to empower people to accept and understand autism and neurodiversity as natural variations in the ways that humans are. And specifically, we hope to serve and empower autistic people who are looking for tools and community. But we also wrote it for families, professionals, all sorts of people can gain some knowledge. In my experience, a lot of families and caregivers kind of naturally become allies and advocates as they come to know the autistic child or people in their lives. And we just try to help them center the autistic perspectives rather than relying entirely on neurotypical experts. And also, we've found through our own experience and through the experience of our contributors that there are many, many wonderful professionals out there working with neurodivergent populations, but there's also a long way to go in a lot of those areas as well. So let me give you a taste of what these hundreds of perspectives have to offer. In this presentation, given the time constraints, I'm going to focus on just the very first part of our book. It's kind of like the groundwork we lay in the introduction. It's relevant to sort of all of the later phases, whether you're doing something in your own home or doing something on a more like a nonprofit scale or a cultural scale. If I have time, which I don't think I will, I sometimes talk a little bit about the first steps of stage 1 after the groundwork, just because that's about making personal changes from listening and learning. Because we believe the future of advocacy is genuinely in listening to actually autistic perspectives. But these concepts that I'm going to talk about in the next 15-20 minutes really underpin all of the later steps in both of our books. Whether it's social justice advocacy or trying to make your home more inclusive. I'm also open to talking about more of the later parts of the book or young adulthood and building independence during the Q&A, if that's relevant to people. One of my favorite parts of what we did was we created these self-reflection questions at the end of each section. The discussion guide really takes that, which is free and downloadable. I'm not trying to sell something. The discussion guide has really kind of unpacks all of those questions, and it really can be, I think, very useful, we've been told. So I'm going to start with the groundwork that we need to lay before we even make the first more active step. I love to start by talking about this experiment by Dr. Damian Milton, and this experiment to me is such a great illustration of why we advocate for these principles. So Dr. Damian Milton created an experiment that consisted of 3 different groups playing a modified game of telephone. One of the groups was all neurotypical, one of the groups was all autistic, and one was mixed. So the neurotypical group did fine, so did the autistic group, but the group that was mixed really struggled. And he, out of this, came up with a model of the double empathy problem, and in which these 2 groups, their neurology can somehow inherently make it hard for them to understand each other. But in their own groups, right, it wasn't like that, it was kind of stunning to people because well, I'll tell you, when my friend told me about this, the first time I ever heard about it, I just started crying. Because people always think like, oh, I always thought, I shouldn't say people always think, I always thought there was something wrong with me. And this experiment really showed me that it's not a problem with me, it's a problem with communication. It's a problem with an environment in which my kind of communication wasn't necessarily being honored or being respected, but there are environments in which that could thrive. So it's really a mutual communication issue, not the fault of one group or the other. And the mainstream autism industry is changing, but it's for so long focused on fixing autistic people. So I think this experiment really gives a great introduction to some of our most basic introductory points, which are based on the premise that these problems happen because neurodivergent people are living in a neurotypical world, and these problems are something that we can mitigate or even vanquish with the right approach, right? And without placing all of the burden or fault on autistic people. So the very first section in our introduction begins to establish this approach of trying to mitigate these issues in such a way that is proactive for everyone and not critical of one group or the other, by asking people to redirect their efforts around autism and neurodiversity in a positive direction, right? So you're here, so I think we can safely say you probably want to make the world a better place for neurodiverse people. You want to help make this world a place where that game of telephone in that experiment looks a bit better for autistic people, right? So one of the main things that we heard from our participants in our first book and our second book was that instead of feeling fear or sadness or looking for a cure, many autistic people want people to know that there are things we can do with our energy that will actually uplift us, right? Make the world a more equitable, safe, and fair place for neurodivergent people. So one thing coming out of this that I want autistic people to know, and their allies and advocates, is that we're allowed to ask for that, right? We're allowed to ask people to see us or our partner or our child or our student or our teacher in a more evolved way. Our second basic ground rule is that being a genuine advocate or ally really rests on respect and listening. And so we, in the book and through our respondents, ask people to advocate or ally with people with care. And by the way, this guidance that I'm talking about here pertains in most cases to just about all differences, right? Whether that's learning differences or mental health differences, physical or cognitive differences, wherever possible, to listen to those who experience that difference, right? So for example, over time, and again, I'm sharing this with permission, my son taught me how he needed me to advocate for him. I had my own ideas about what he should do. And I mean, of course, parents have a lot of that, but sometimes we're wrong. I'm gonna give an example that doesn't look very good for me, but he needed, how he taught me how he needed me to advocate for him rather than solely focusing on my own agenda, right? So in my son's junior year, he worked really hard to get off his IEP. He was a sensitive, super smart student who sometimes was labeled, as people often do, as a special education student, right? He felt shame coming from his peers at times, and sometimes condescension coming from some of the staff. And as an aside, can we eradicate special education hallways? That is such a painful place for students to be, and I've got a whole section on it in the next book. But I wanted to fight to keep him on his IEP because he wasn't the most organized person on the planet, didn't have the world's most executive function, but he asked me to trust him. And I looked at him, and I somehow in my heart, very reluctantly and with a lot of trepidation, decided that his feeling that I believed in him was more important than school success. And at that moment, I was completely sure of what the outcome was going to be, which was going to be, as he used to say when he was little, a disastrophe. Well, guess what? He wrote his college application essay on how I got off my IEP and onto the honor roll, which he remained on until graduation in the pandemic. He was accepted at and offered partial to full scholarships at all 8 colleges he applied to. Things got a little different after that, but it was, the story isn't over yet. So I encourage you, coming as a practical tip out of this one, to believe that you are empowered to ask people to listen to and respect you as an equal human being, or to be empowered to ask people to listen to your child, or to listen to your child, or your student, or your partner. Our third basic grounding element is knowing that language evolves, right? So language is always changing, and we're always learning. And different people want different things and use different language. So like one great way to refer to people and talk about people and talk to people is simply to ask what feels comfortable for them. So that's what we do in our books. Like you'll hear a lot of, or read a lot of different language. Some people use different terms around their neurodivergence. Some people find the term Asperger's very offensive. Other people have sort of claimed it for their own. Person-first language versus, all that kind of stuff. It's always evolving. So what we commit to doing is to honoring personal preferences, as well as doing our best to respect current best practices in our own usage of language. I really encourage you to figure out, through learning and listening, what might be the language that feels most inclusive to the people in your life, and then to try to use it. And if someone wants something different, it can get a little tricky with all the different things, but to just do our best in that regard. That's really important, I think, for a lot of people who had a history of being sort of marginalized through the way people refer to them. So fourth basic ground rule, bearing in mind that we are all unique, right? Just as each human has their own strengths and weaknesses, each autistic human has the same. Referring back to the language thing, we stay away from labels as much as we can, like high and low functioning. Those kind of labels a lot of people find really painful and offensive and even incorrect. Some people are comfortable with terms like high and low support needs. But that description of a kind of person has to do with the interface between these neurotypical expectations or environments and then a specific autistic human being. So each autistic person also has particular interests and character traits and emotional tendencies and intellectual abilities and physical abilities, just like anyone else, right? So perhaps our most fundamental guidance based on these many, many interviews is to see each person as just that, as themselves. It doesn't sound too hard, right? But it doesn't always happen. So we celebrate seeing every person as unique, and we believe that truly uplifting self-advocacy, advocacy, and allyship rest on that principle. And that brings me to our fifth and final basic ground rule, which is to remember that we all make mistakes, right? So if you hear yourself in any of the issues that I've mentioned, just remember that. Taking responsibility for something that we might have done better just makes us grow and makes us do better the next time, right? So at the beginning, I talked about truly welcoming spaces. And these principles, so staying away from negative reactions and negative actions and evolving into a more positive vision of neurodiversity, listening, that's number 2, and being careful around language, and then remembering that we're all unique and remembering that we all make mistakes. These are the kind of principles, these are really basic principles that underlie those kinds of spaces. So we can start with those to begin to shape our advocacy and allyship. And then from there, whatever way you're able to speak out, integrating those principles will ensure that you're advocating or allying in a way that is truly respectful and inclusive, and creating a place or a relationship with that neurodivergent person that really will allow them to flourish. So I think I'm going to take 5 more minutes and just begin to get into the next section of the book, since we have a little bit of time. But I wanted to pause again and see if anyone has any clarification questions at this point. I have one thing that I always like to say at this time. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to get into, I don't think I will, is when I use the word disabled or disability, I'm coming from something that's called the social model of disability that doesn't view the individual as having a lack or an issue or something like that, but sees certain environments or contexts as disabling to that person. So when I talk about disability, I mean that through certain situations or environments, someone is disabled by those environments or situations, okay? Mm-hmm. So Like I said, I'm going to take 5 minutes and just begin sort of the stage 1, step 1 about building an advocacy base by listening and learning. So we take these ground rules, these 5 ground rules that I've just explained, and we apply them to how we listen and learn and grow. So we think that we know how to listen and learn in an open-minded way, but do we really do that? There's a pose in yoga that's called mountain pose, and I don't know if anyone here is familiar with that, but it's basically just a standing pose, and it's like the hardest pose to do because everyone already thinks they know how to do that, but instead they're really like hunching and uneven and tense and stuck in their heads and everything else, and that's kind of how we usually listen, honestly, just being honest. we all tend to really get stuck in other stuff when we're supposed to be listening. So in this, our very first stage of our very first stage is about emphasizing acceptance. So I talked a little bit about that before, but people are always asking me, like, why is acceptance better than awareness? And it's basically because you don't need to be aware to have a fundamental attitude of acceptance, right? You don't need to know. Awareness is sort of like this whole knowledge about something. That why do you need that? So we feel pretty fiercely, but don't get me started, just that acceptance is really where it all starts. So how do we build acceptance, right? Again, we start with ourselves in this stage, but we ask several specific things of others. So one thing that a lot of people are familiar with is a feeling of panic when you hear we get a feeling of panic when we hear a diagnosis or label, right? So our respondents in our first book really wanted people to replace that panic with growth in awareness. When we see differences in ourselves or our children or others, we might have sort of a naturally ignorant reaction. And ignorant literally means not knowing. That's because we don't know, right? So we're talking here about building acceptance, but one part of that, when you start to unpack it, does just consist of embodying acceptance before we have any of that knowledge or details, right? You start to panic, go back to the acceptance, right? Go back to, like a lot of people, when you hear a label or diagnosis, think that suddenly yourself or your child or your partner or whatever is a different person. No, they're the same person. They're still the same person, right? So our actually autistic respondents also wanted to speak out for reframing autism as a way of being, not a tragedy, right? Autism is an expression of the way that human brains can grow. So it's not a tragedy or a miracle. I mean, so far as the human brain in itself is kind of a miracle, right? But autism isn't. It's just a way that human brains grow. So we've all heard people framing it as a burden or a disease, and those stereotypes go against science, and they go against people's lived realities. So our actually autistic respondents are asking people to take these stereotypes, these destructive stereotypes, not as facts, but to really see us. So then, as part of this, if you're ready, you might also drop some science or perspective on the people who share discriminatory or erroneous ideas, right? As we see oppression or discrimination in the world, and we gain more confidence and tools to deal with it, we start to speak out more, I think. Okay, I'm going to close with this, which is the final piece of this first step of the first stage, is to focus on eliminating barriers instead of so-called bad behaviors or attributes, right? So for autistic people, many environments or unspoken rules or interactions can be disabling, as I started to explain before. So the idea is that it's not that there's a problem or issue with the autistic person, but rather that it's the context that is whether it's actively or passively disabling, right? So on a micro level in our own homes and lives and families, there are so many ways we can support neurodivergent people by figuring out what's disabling to us or our loved ones, and then tweaking that factor to be less disabling or even not disabling, so that the people we care about or ourselves can grow, right? Couple of examples of this. One example is that as I've been giving these talks over the last year and a half, I've learned that certain kinds of lights are disabling to me in this context. And I've been really empowered to take a look around and see if I'm going to be able to do it or to ask people to change them. Another barrier that I can think of from my own life is looking back on graduate school, there were a lot of unspoken social rules and social codes that I was really unaware of, and I think it would have been good to know some of those things. That's removing a barrier, right? If there had been someone there who had said, you know, you need to be really respectful to that professor, then I might have, you know, I mean, I did fine, but I always did it through working harder and, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure I would have changed my behavior, but it would have showed me what was there that I didn't see, right? So I think that that focus on removing barriers and removing obstacles to flourishing can be a really, really helpful thing for autistic people and for people in general. So I'm going to end there, but thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Danielle Cook. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Hopkinton Public Library, and I'm here with my colleague Jack Miller, our teen librarian. We're here to invite you to join us for our reading marathon.
For our reading marathon, simply log 26 hours of reading or other activities in minute increments, and then you'll be able to join us from our trip from Hopkinton to Boston, reading the whole way. Visit our website to sign up for a registration link as well as more details.
Did you know only 34% of children are highly resilient? That means 66% of kids aren't able to cope with and quickly overcome challenges. These findings come from the Cigna Resilience Index, the largest U.S. survey on resilience. Unfortunately, challenges facing children are on the rise. From academics to sports to social pressures, our kids are facing adversity at an alarming rate. For example, social media has changed the way children communicate. This can negatively impact children's confidence and perceptions of themselves. That's why raising a resilient kid is more important than ever. The MRP Project's Raising Resilient Kids program is for parents who want to ensure their child can positively and productively overcome life's obstacles. The series lays the foundation for resilience by arming parents with the tools needed to help kids cope with adversity.
In the 6-week series, we'll highlight the essential role obstacles play in children's development. The facilitators discourage parents from trying to fix problems. Instead, we discuss specific behaviors, thoughts, and actions to help children work through specific situations. We'll provide strategies that can be used to help deal with similar situations in the future. We also spend time during the first couple of sessions discussing ourselves and our own resilience. This is an important aspect to our curriculum, as it is critical for us as parents to be resilient. We can't expect our children to be resilient unless we're modeling resilient behaviors for them. Each class focuses on one topic, and the facilitators provide time for problem solving and group discussions. Participants can support each other, share lessons learned, discuss experiences, and learn from one another.
One of our recent participants said, and I quote, "Raising Resilient Kids was a wonderful series that I am so happy I had the opportunity to participate in. Through this series, I gained new strategies to work with my own children through situations that in the past have felt overwhelming to me. I walked away from this series with new language to use with my children and to help guide them through situations they may encounter in everyday life growing up. I am truly grateful for the discussions, encouragement, and guidance that this series provided. I'd encourage any parent to participate in the MRP's Raising Resilient Kids. If you want to sign up, please visit the mrpproject.org/raisingresilientkids.
The Sustainable Green Committee is a group of 15 people working hard to help Hopkinton address the serious environmental issues facing us. We develop plans and practical solutions to help save not only our special slice of the planet, but also help save residents, businesses, and municipal organizations money. Double green power. This includes a municipal aggregation plan, so our electricity comes from green supplies, a climate action plan to help us meet the state's net zero carbon emissions target, and so much more. We also provide useful information on green topics. Our website, hopgreen.org, aims to be a one-stop spot for links to some of the best resources out there on solar, EVs, waste reduction, heating, and safe natural resource management. Our social media and email lists help to keep anyone who wants to be informed about everything we're doing, as well as the latest green news. We're always looking for help, so contact us if you'd like to work on this important mission. Thank you.
Solar power is a free gift from the universe. You'll be very surprised at how many programs there are that offer rebates and information for you to save money on your business and your home. You owe it to yourself to find out more information. Go to the website www.mass.gov/solar-information-programs. Many businesses around town are already taking advantage of solar power. Ask your neighbors what they think. You're saving money and you're saving the planet. Life doesn't get more simple than that.
Hi, my name is Danielle Cook. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Hopkinton Public Library, and I'm here with my colleague Jack Miller, our teen librarian. We're here to invite you to join us for our reading marathon.
For our reading marathon, simply log 26 hours of reading or other activities in minute increments, and then you'll be able to join us from our trip from Hopkinton to Boston, reading the whole way. Visit our website to sign up for a registration link as well as more details.